Welcome to Behavior, Evolution, and Culture speaker series. Let me just announce we have a couple more talks left this quarter. The 24th next week will be Carlos Navarrete from Michigan State University. Sexual Selection and the Psychological Architecture of Race Prejudice is the title of his talk. That will be on the 24th. The week after that, the 31st of Monday, is a holiday, so we won't have the Beck talk on that Monday because there will be no school on Monday, the 31st. But on Tuesday, the 1st, the day after, was that Memorial Day? Is that what that is? The day after Memorial Day, on Tuesday, the 1st, we will have Quentin Atkinson from the University of Oxford Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology, and his talk will be titled The Cultural Evolution of Human Languages. And that will be the last talk of the quarter, so we have 2 more talks left. And today it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Elizabeth Pillsworth from Cal State University Fullerton Department of Anthropology, who is going to be talking to us about mate choice among the Shuar of Ecuador.
For inviting me. It's great to be back at UCLA. I feel like I was just here last week. In fact, though, I've already gotten so far off that quarter system thing. We're in finals right now, so it's amazing to me that you still have like 3 more talks left. But here I thought I am today going to be talking about female choice in human mating, using some examples from the Shuar to talk about how much choice women may or may not actually have in terms of making mating decisions. This is a slightly unusual talk for me because it is not data heavy. So this is mostly some ideas and a lot of ethnographic description. So don't get too upset by the dearth of graphs and charts and regression plots and things like that. So very, very briefly, I'm not going to go over this because everybody in this room, I am sure, is familiar with the theories of sexual selection and knows that as part of that, there are 2 primary forms of sexual selection that was outlined by Darwin: male-male competition and female choice. And that across most of the natural world, female choice is actually a very strong form of sexual selection, such that females' choosiness over who they mate with, what kinds of traits they're looking for in a sexual partner, has a huge effect on traits that are carried by males and can really drive species-typical behaviors, morphology, and all sorts of things. Now, in humans, there's a huge literature on mate preferences, and women's mate preferences have been very heavily studied, both in terms of, I'm going to see if it will actually work here. Hey, I guess it will. Both in terms of preferences for long-term romantic partners, so there have been some very large cross-cultural studies done looking at women's stated preferences in terms of what kinds of traits they're interested in a potential long-term partner. There have been studies that have looked specifically at the trade-offs that women face when they're looking for different kinds of characteristics in long-term partners, whether they're interested in access to resources or physical attractiveness, dominance, all sorts of traits that are important in a potential mate, and what kinds of things are most important given the specific context. There have been some very interesting studies looking at revealed preferences, some of which I have spoken about to many of you before in terms of research I've done with the Shuar, looking at what kinds of characteristics actually predict attraction to potential long-term partners. Also very complicated studies where researchers have set up their very own speed dating situations in order to study revealed preferences in long-term partners. There have been studies looking at environment-specific preferences. So how do preferences change in different contexts and different environments? There is also an enormous literature looking at preferences for sexual partners. There have been studies looking at ovulatory cycle shifts in preferences. So what kinds of characteristics are most important for females when they're seeking out sexual partners at the time they're most likely to conceive? How do these preferences change with fertility? How do they change according to the current context that a woman is in? There have been studies looking at scent preferences, studies looking at women's ratings of men using video, motion detection studies, again, studies of the trade-offs, what kinds of qualities are more important in certain contexts or at certain times of the menstrual cycle. Behavioral studies, what kinds of things are women actually doing to attract mates at specific times of the cycle. So this is just by way of saying, which I think is not a surprise, again, to anybody in this room, that there's a huge amount of literature and a huge amount of energy, research energy, focused on women's mate preferences in humans and how these are shaping human behavior and human lives. There have been some critiques about this, however, the most salient of which is that there are also well-known constraints on female choice in humans. Across many cultures and across history, women have not always had the freedom to express their desires or pursue their choices in a way that's very open. Frequently, parents have control over female choice, or other individuals have control. Frequently, women are married at a very young age before they have a lot of choice. Males often dominate in societies such that women aren't free to pursue their own preferences. And there have been a couple of studies put out fairly recently by Menolis Apostolou, who has used the standard cross-cultural sample to look at really how much free choice there seems to be cross-culturally in terms of women's ability to make their own mating decisions. So this is looking across hunter-gatherer populations, again from the standard cross-cultural sample. And courtship, according to this, is reported to be the very rarest form of marriage. As you can see, according to these data, in most societies, parental arrangement is the most common form of marriage, or close kin arrangement is the second, or even courtship that requires parental approval. But that courtship with autonomous decision-making seems to be quite rare. Similarly, Apostolou looked across different subsistence patterns, and again found that courtship is reported to be the rarest form of marriage across many different forms of subsistence. Again, you can see that the largest for most of these component is parental arrangement, and that a good chunk of societies are also defined by courtship that requires parental approval, or parental approval and courtship alternating combined. Yes?
How is parental arrangement defined?
That's a very good question. So the way that these data are found is in the standard cross-cultural sample. One can go to the ethnographies and see how they have been coded in terms of what kind of marriage arrangement they have. Are they coded as, and I'll actually get to later the full codings that they have. So it's based on ethnographers' reports. And this is something I'm going to talk about much later in great detail. But basically what we have to go on is what people have said in their ethnographies. Do they say that in this society, parents arrange marriages? There are some ethnographies, there will be a lot of detail that will give people a finer tuned understanding of what's actually going on in the ground. Or it may just be something like parents decide. That's where the data comes from. And actually I'll show you at the very end that I think that the way these data were compiled is a little misleading because it collapses the actual categories that are in the standard cross-cultural sample in ways that make it seem that there's less choice than there actually is. But we'll get there. So some scholars have taken these patterns to suggest that female choice looks like it's something that may be evolutionarily novel, that this is really a byproduct of modern culture where we have autonomous decision-making and people find their mates through courtship and romantic love, and that therefore female choice really could not have had a very strong influence on human evolution. I will argue that this is inaccurate and not a reasonable conclusion to draw for several reasons. One, from a theoretical perspective, an event does not need to be common to be selectively significant. This is a basic misunderstanding of the ways that natural selection works. Rare events can be extremely selectively significant. Secondly, I will argue that women do have opportunities to enact choice, even in the most restrictive of contexts. This is really the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to give you lots of examples from one such society, which is a paternalistic society, where there's a lot of control over women, the Shuar and talk about the various ways that women actually do pursue their own preferences and defy the choices made by others for them. And finally, and this gets to the point that Marty asked, I'll also argue that systems really may not be as restrictive as is represented with these data that have been flying around. So first, this idea of whether or not selection can act on very rare events. So even if female choice is an extremely rare event in human societies, can that still be selectively significant? Well, let's look at a case that has nothing to do with mating at all, and the ways that selection has acted to affect adaptations in response to rare events. And we look at the case of high altitude, living at high altitude. So a very small proportion of the human population lives at high altitude. High altitude is generally defined as 2,500 meters or higher. You can see that's a very, very small proportion of the human population that lives at such altitudes. And there are 3 different types of adaptation that we see in response to this really rare event, this feature that most people are not actually experiencing. One is short-term plasticity. So everybody in this room, whether or not you've ever been to high altitude, whether or not you were born at high altitude, most people will experience a form of acclimatization if you go to high altitude. We have adaptations such that our body adjusts to high altitude. Our basal metabolism increases, heart rate and breath rate increase, our vascular system constricts, increasing the amount of blood and increasing the number of red blood cells over a short term. There's also developmental adaptations, so that individuals who are born at high altitude look different from those who are born at lower altitude. And these have long-standing effects throughout the lifespan, so they're developmental in that they are not innate. They're not necessarily going to be there for this individual if they were born at low altitude. But once the ball has gotten rolling, these are lifelong changes. So, for example, infants born at high altitude tend to have much lower birth weight and a slower development than infants born at low altitude. And then as adults, these individuals will have the same sort of basal metabolism rate as individuals who were born at sea level and who are living at sea level. So this is a lifelong adaptation that is triggered developmentally by being in the womb for a mother who's at high altitude. But then there are also some more static adaptations, population differences. So for example, the places where we have people living in high altitude, the most common is in Tibet, in the Andes. There people have been at high altitude for a very long time. In Tibet, 6,000, maybe as long as 25,000 years living in high altitude. In the Andes, 6,000 to 9,000 years of history living in high altitude. We can compare individuals in those regions to those, for example, living in the Rockies, where people have only been living year-round at high altitude for a few hundred years. And we see, for example, that children of Andean ancestry, even if they're born at sea level and raised at sea level, have enlarged chests, which is an adaptation to being able to get more oxygen into the blood, an adaptation to living at high altitude. We don't see that kind of adaptation in individuals who are have ancestors who live in the Rockies, who haven't been there as long. So these are the kinds of adaptations that we can see to events that are not common, that not every person is going to face, and yet these are very selectively important situations such that we do as a species have adaptations for them. It's really the marginal effects that are what matter in natural selection. It's not about whether something is constantly present and always going on in somebody's life, but natural selection will actually detect variation between individuals that predict fitness variance, and it will shuffle amongst all of the different marginal effects. So these effects may be very small, and yet natural selection will still find them relative to other effects. Some effects may be much larger, but that doesn't mean the small effects are not still significant. They may interact with other variables, or they may even be dependent on moderators such that these effects are not always observable, that they are not always there. But again, natural selection will find these marginal effects and will act on them. So ultimately, for female choice to have no effect on human psychology or human behavior or human morphology, it would really have to statistically zero out over evolutionary time. It would have to have no effect, whether large or small. And I don't think that's the case. I think that's pretty obviously not the case. But I'm going to give you a lot of examples of ways that female choice can affect reproductive fitness. And I'm going to give you some examples from the Shuar, where I've worked for now several years, of ways that women are enacting their choices in the face of a great deal of constraint, actually. So let me give you a little bit of the historical context of the Shuar. Clark was very impressed with my new little map showing the Shuar territory. Shuar are hunter-horticulturalists who live in the Amazon basin, primarily in Ecuador, but also a little bit in Peru, in fact, probably a bit more in Peru than I have indicated there. They are a large indigenous population in the Amazon basin. They're one of they're I guess the second largest population after the Quechua. The Shuar resisted colonial influence until the 1950s. This is important because I'm going to talk about stories of relationship, creation, formation, maintenance, and they span women's stories from women who are in their teens and 20s today to women who are in their 50s and 60s today. And there are women alive who really were getting married, having children, who were doing this before there was much impact of colonialism at all in some of these villages. This has been relatively recent, the amount of culture change that's going on in the villages. And I also worked, as most of you know, in several different villages that vary in the amount of acculturation that they've experienced. As I mentioned, the Shuar are hunter-horticulturalists. Again, there's a great deal of variation between the villages where I've worked, such that in some of them, people are much more integrated into the market economy of Ecuador, and they actually do purchase a great deal of their food. In some of the other villages where I've worked, they still rely primarily on hunting and horticulture. Traditionally, families were arranged in independent households. That would be a man and his wife, or usually two wives, and their unmarried children, or their daughter and her husband before they had any children. So there was historically a matrilocal, temporary matrilocal residence. So couples would stay with the wife's family for about a year until the first baby was born, and then they would set up their own household somewhere in the vicinity. And traditionally, marriage was characterized by alliances that were forged between male in-laws. So this has been characterized in many ethnographies, well, the three that exist, as marriages amongst the Shuar really being about relationships between men. This is really about fathers-in-law finding sons-in-law and forming alliances. The Shuar have a history of very violent interaction with one another, and these alliances, these male-male alliances, were extremely important in terms of interpersonal and tribal warfare. There's also a history of child betrothal of girls. So historically, daughters may be given in marriage at a very young age, definitely prepubescent, even sometimes because there was a strong preference for cross-cousin marriage and because there was a strong preference for polygamous marriage, and having sisters as co-wives, sororal polygamy was preferred. Frequently, a man, if he married one girl, would be promised the as yet unborn daughters in that family. So there was even pre-birth betrothal of girls historically. Historically, the Shuar practiced general polygamy. Most men did have more than one wife. This is possible in part because many of the men killed each other, so there was a pretty skewed sex ratio at that time. And there was a very strong patriarchal rule. Males very definitively had the authority in the household. They directed the resources, they directed movements of the family, and they directed marriage arrangements. So this history is based primarily, as I said, on there's a couple of older ethnographies, but also Rubinstein recently, in the early 90s anyway, was looking at chain marriage amongst the Shuar and had the same history of the Shuar marriages in the past. And as I said, where I've been working, I see a great deal of variation in terms of marital formation that reflects some of these traditional ways and also some of the changes that have been going on. So the data that I have been collecting, I've been collecting some Shuar relationship data for several years now. The data that I'm going to be talking about today, which is mostly descriptive data, so don't get too excited about any hypothesis testing, is based on interviews and participant observation during 15 months of field work between 2003 and 2006. This has been supplemented with previously collected genealogical data. It's also been supplemented actually since then, subsequently collected genealogical data. And most of this data comes from two Shuar villages I've worked in, although not all of it. There are people that I've talked to in other places as well. And I'm not going to give you too much detail on these villages. I think a lot of people in this room have probably heard a lot about these two villages, but I will tell you briefly that they vary tremendously, significantly in size. So one of these villages is on a main road. It's got about 70 households, about 140, 150 adults living there, and double that again for the number of children. There's electricity, there's a lot of wage labor, people purchase their food. The other village I primarily work in is a much more remote village that is, at least the last time I was there, about 12 miles from the nearest road. There's now a road that goes up to within about a 20-minute walk of the village. So it'll be exciting when I go this summer, be able to actually take baby on the road. There, again, last I was there, when I was collecting these data, there was no electricity, no propane gas, there was very little wage labor, very little means of getting food other than subsistence activities. So these two villages differ quite a bit in terms of how much they're involved in the larger Ecuadorian culture. And the data that I'm going to be talking about includes relationship data for overall a total of 84 women and 87 men. Again, this crosses all age groups, from the youngest in my sample who actually have relationship data are 13, up to I think the oldest person that I spoke to about relationship variables was in their mid to late 60s. So covers all age groups. So what do contemporary marriage patterns look like? They are changing somewhat from that historical picture that I drew for you, but they're still somewhat traditional. So 90% of all women that I spoke to were married between the ages of 13 and 19. The average age of marriage today is 17.4 for women. For men, the average age of marriage today is about 21. So they still get married fairly young. The average age at first birth goes right along with that. Average age at first birth is about 18. And the average lifetime fertility is about 7 for women, 7 offspring. So it's still a high fertility population and early age of marriage. Autonomous choice is becoming more normative. So this is something that is now an accepted part of Shuar culture, that people may date, court, fall in love, get married. This is definitely something that's occurring more and more often. Parental consent still remains very strongly desired. Parental veto is still alive and well, and when it is not listened to, I will tell you about some various ways that parents may try and enforce their parental veto. Forced marriage still occurs, though it's rare. So this does not happen, again, as often as it did historically, but it does occur. And in fact, many of the women that I spoke to who are over age 35 when I was there, so over age 38 now, had reported being married against their will. This was relatively common amongst women of that age group. And at least 3 women who were less than 20 at this time, so this was, a couple of years ago, less than 20 years old in 2006, had reported being married against their will before the age of 14. So again, this is a sample of only 80-some women, and these are of the women under 20, 3 of them had been married before 14 against their will. So this is something that still happens, yeah?
I was just curious, do you have any ideas about rates of infant mortality? Just interested in knowing.
I do not have any data on infant mortality. I'm sorry. Do you have any data on infant mortality? Okay, I'm sorry. Hopefully I will get some in the next few visits. And in fact, one of the women who I spoke to at the time in her 50s, she was 56 at about the time when I spoke to her in 2005. She told a story that was something, as I said, for these women over age 35, was a relatively common story that I heard when she was 14. her parents came up to her and said, well, this guy is here, he'd like to marry you, and so we're going to give you to him in marriage. And she, the way she described it was, wow, this was, this came totally out of the blue. I was not thinking about mating, marriage, partners, families, anything at all. This was something totally out of the blue. She didn't want to do it. She cried, and yet they still went through with it. And in her case, it actually worked out quite well. The husband, the guy that she married, was 26. So that's typical. The girls who are married off at a much younger age, usually the men are about 10 years older on average than they are when they're married at that young age. In her case, that worked out really well. She's still married to him. She has a co-wife who's her younger sister. She has several children, and everything is good. But I will tell you about some other situations where it didn't work out quite as well. So polygamy and male authority. Today, it is still, by tradition and in practice, the fact that men have ultimate authority in the household. This is not to say that women have no freedom. They do. They have lots of ways of asserting their autonomy, but ultimately men have the last say. They typically make decisions about resources at all levels, and this goes from as personal level as in terms of the distribution of the native beverage, the chicha, which is a huge part of the culture. Women make the chicha, women pass out the chicha, but men are actually the owners of it. So a man will say to his wife, distribute the chicha. She will start passing out the chicha, the man will tell her, stop serving the chicha. And so even at that very basic level, men make decisions about resources, up to and including whether or not they should send their daughter to school, whether they should give their daughter in marriage, whether they should live in this village or another village. So males have an awful lot of say in terms of how resources are being utilized. Fathers still have the authority to give a daughter as a wife. As I just said, it's becoming more and more rare that men will just give their daughters away to a buddy or a potential ally as a wife, but it does still occur, particularly if the guy who wants to be the husband has a steady job and good income. This is very desirable. Overt polygamy is declining in practice. Only 3 men in the villages where I worked were explicitly polygamously married. Although when and this was the percentage I couldn't find just a minute ago, when I interviewed high school students and got them to report how many polygamously married individuals there were in their families, that percentage was much higher. But more importantly, the practice of affairs, unofficial second families, so individuals who don't say that they actually are polygamously married but have an entirely second family living in another village, and serial monogamy all are quite common. And in fact, I do have this data on another slide further down, but about 40% of the men in the villages that I worked with were known to have had affairs. And now those are affairs that were reported to me by third parties and verified by other third parties. So, there's always question as to the data about affairs. But this was not questions I did not solicit this information. This was information that was given freely, and that was 40% of the men were at least reported to have had affairs. So there's, even though there is a much lower level of official polygamy going on, there's still an awful lot of male sexual activity. So how do Shuar women affect their reproductive fitness? Well, they can do this by rejecting the choices that others have made for them, or they can do this by pursuing their own desires in opposition to others' wishes. And I'm going to go through several of the strategies that women have available to them in this particular society. So the most basic is refusal. So as I said, traditionally women were given in marriage, often at a young age. Even today, there are women who are given in marriage at a fairly young age. But both in the ethnographic literature and in the stories that, in the interviews that I had with people, it becomes clear that women had the opportunity to at least attempt to reject, to refuse this partnership. And often they would. Now, it didn't always work out. But as I said, with that one woman in her 50s who had been married when she was 14, she at first refused. She cried. She asked her parents. She solicited aid from her siblings. So this is a strategy that is open to women. Does not always work. Today, we actually see an almost reversal of the parent-offspring conflict in that parents may be very gung-ho about a particular suitor. A girl may reject him for a long time, leading to long courtships. Men will bring gifts to them, help them clear their garden, resort to magic. But we'll also see the reverse, which is that girls may want to get married, and their parents may refuse. So there's parent-offspring conflict going in both directions. So one of the outcomes of this is that we do see much longer sorts of courtship. Males are engaged in a great deal of effort trying to win over girls, where in the past, in accordance with some of the things that Malice also was saying, men may have spent more energy trying to win over fathers-in-law and trying to signal to them. Another thing that women can do is they can desert their relationship. And this actually happens with startling frequency. So if you ask any average person in a Shuar village to tell you what Shuar marriage is all about, they will say, well, in Shuar culture, marriage is forever. It's very serious, we take it very seriously, and Shuar marriage lasts forever. And yet, if you talk for a few more minutes, you will hear stories about 5 different people who have left their spouse and married somebody else. So this is something that happens quite frequently. What's interesting about this idea of desertion is that it is pretty much entirely defined by females leaving their husbands. Men do not desert their wives and destroy the marriage. The marriage still exists. They may desert their wives. They may start new families. They may live somewhere else for a long period of time, but they always still have that marriage bond there. And the woman is still, in many ways, held to that marriage bond. But women can leave their partners. Now, I say can. They do this at great risk to themselves. This is not something that is accepted by men. Men will chase their wives down with machetes if need be. They will look for them in the villages. Women may return to their parents' house. They may run off with other men. They may run off to the city to seek employment. But one of the things that's pretty constant is that they have to hide for a while. They have to get away from the husband who will try and bring them back. This is a really common strategy. However, this is something that I hear all the time. I know personally many women and many husbands who have been deserted by their wives, many children whose wives have left. This is something that happens with some frequency, even though there is, like I said, a great deal of risk. Most men do not take this lying down. Typically, women who pursue this strategy will abandon their older children, leave them with either the father or more typically with the father's kin, so with their mother-in-law or their sisters-in-law. And they'll bring their youngest children with them, those who are still nursing or that they still carry. And most women, and this is very important when we're thinking about the influence of female choice, most of the women who have deserted their husbands have remarried to a man of their choice and continued to have children. And I say most, it would actually be all, but I did interview a couple of girls who had run away from their husbands who were only in their early teens and had not yet remarried. But typically, any woman who runs away from her husband will remarry a man of her choice and continue to have children, therefore affecting her own choices. Another strategy that's open to females that's available is suicide, which of course is not a very good strategy if you're actually successful at it. That will have a pretty detrimental effect on your reproductive success. But it can be a very good bargaining chip. Barbasco is a poisonous root that's used in these areas for fishing. Women have been reported to take Barbasco as, again, an attempted suicide, but potentially also as a threat. So, again, this doesn't happen very often. This actually occurred only once in all the time that I've been in Ecuador. But I've heard lots and lots of stories, again, that are more distant. So people talk about, oh, there was a girl who took Barbasco, my parents knew her. But one of the things that you do hear in most of these stories is that frequently a woman will take Barbasco when somebody else is likely to find her. So it may be that this is a strategy in order to elicit aid from her own family, to elicit censure of her husband if he's not treating her well, not necessarily actually to die, though that does unfortunately happen. but it does also have really useful effects in eliciting aid from the woman's own family. This is usually a strong motivation to intervene in the relationship or to let the woman come back to her natal home and let her start again. Adultery is something else that women may do. There's a picture of trees there because I wasn't going to put a picture of any person up, and I just thought that was indicative of the fact that people can sneak around in the jungle without anybody seeing them. So thought about putting a picture of Tiger Woods up, but thought that would be too. So adultery is another strategy that women can pursue. This is something that is interesting because it's a very salient concern to men and has been historically. So again, when you look at the ethnographies, there's reports of men being very, very concerned about their wives cheating on them, particularly when they're in the garden. So women do all of the gardening work amongst the Shuar. Gardens are usually quite a distance away from the household, from the homestead, and in dense jungle like this. So this is a concern that males have had for a long time about their wives potentially taking lovers while they're in the garden. And in fact, the ethnographies report special traps that were actually laid to catch interlopers in the gardens that would snag them so that they could be dealt with in person. Which usually the punishment for adultery historically was certain beheading for the male who was interloping, but quite frequently also death to the wife. And this is because there would otherwise be a risk of an extended blood feud if the wife's, or if the lover's family thought that he had been killed unfairly, such that the wife was not also paying the price. This could result in an extended blood feud, which would be very costly. So frequently the wife was murdered as well. Today, usually decapitation is not the most common punishment for suspected or discovered infidelity. Beating is quite common, so there are still quite dire costs that women pay if they do get caught having adulterous affairs. Not to mention social costs. There's an enormous amount of social censure. Women may be shamed. They may be cut off from resources. So adultery is a very costly strategy, and yet, again, based on unsolicited reports, so this is just, again, it's gossip, but these were gossip, this was restricted only to unsolicited reports that were verified independently by at least 2 people. So at least 2 people, without any soliciting questions, without my bringing up any adulterous affairs, told me about a supposed affair that a woman had. And about 10%, nearly 10% of the women in these villages had some report of having had an affair. These data, as you can imagine, are extremely sensitive to get. I have not asked any woman specifically about whether or not she's had an affair, because the cost can be great.
Are the men rumored to, I'm just trying to figure out whether there might be underreporting for women. Are the men rumored to have affairs with married women or with unmarried women?
That's a very good question.
That
So
difference might
I
be
think
okay.
I think all the above are happening. I think that the reports for women are probably underreported. Women tend to be more subtle.
Yeah.
Men tend to brag. So that's one of the features. The other is that men do seek their affairs in many different places. So they will have affairs with young unmarried women. They frequently will, because men frequently go to the cities, they will look for affairs in the cities. So that can be another reason why there's actually a much higher rate with men than with the women. A lot of these women don't actually get out to the cities much, which means that they are restricted to having affairs with other people more or less in the village, which they do still do. And in fact, actually, young unmarried men will often pursue married women sexually. And there's actually a whole suite of magical love songs that are designed to protect a woman. Her husband will sing this while he's away on a hunt, to protect her from the seduction of these unmarried men who are attempting to get her to have an affair with them. But yeah, that's why these numbers are definitely not equal. And finally, actually I want to say something else about this, which is just another measure of how this can very strongly affect women's reproductive outcomes, reproductive fitness, is misattributed paternity. So again, these are data for which I don't have anything very firm. I have not done any genetic testing. I don't know that I ever will, because these are very small scale societies and can be quite a nest of worms. But I know of at least one case of misattributed paternity, or at least confused paternity, where there are two men who think they are the fathers of an offspring. So clearly women are affecting their reproductive fitness, their reproductive outcomes through this strategy of having sex with more than just a husband.
I just wanted to clarify something that Marty asked about underreporting that 10%. So is that unsolicited from the woman saying that she had an affair, or
No.
a third party?
It's a third party.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're
Okay,
rumors, essentially is what they are. But again, that's why I also restricted this only to rumors that I heard from at least two independent people. So, you know, there's all sorts of ways that this could be biased. These are not very airtight data on affairs, but that's, again, you know, this is one of the, it's very hard to get that information, and it's one of the things I hope over the years to get better information, but one must tread very carefully on these topics. Because I'm being somewhat glib, but the costs really are quite high. A woman gets caught having an affair, or they can. Sometimes everything goes back to normal. Elopement is another strategy that we see, and this is one of the strategies that's actually more common today than in the past. Of course, in the past, most girls were married when they were very young, before, as my informant had put it, before they were even thinking of such things. So elopement was not as likely to occur. Today, again, we've seen the conflict has actually in some ways switched directions, such that girls in their early teens would like to marry, but their parents often withhold approval. And there are several reasons why they might do that. One is that it actually reflects on parental status. It's a well understood aphorism that basically if you're poor, you get married very early. Going to school is expensive, buying school uniforms is expensive, buying things that you need for your daughters is expensive. So poor girls are more likely to get married young. So it's actually a reflection also on paternal status in the community if their daughters decide to get married very early. So that's one area of conflict. Also, parents do not always have the same choices that females do, that girls do. So young girls who are desiring to get married are often desiring to get married to young men who are about the same age, who do not have any status, who do not have jobs, who do not have much in the way of evidence that they are going to be particularly good providers. Today there are several documented, I have documented them, they've occurred while I've been there, several cases of teenage elopement with varying results. So in many cases, the girls are forcibly brought home. This occurs an awful lot. Girls in these villages frequently will go to high school, and a regional high school that is apart from the home, so this will be in a village that's pretty distant from where the parents are. This is a huge concern amongst parents that girls will run off with boys from the high school or from men from that local village. And in fact, it's a concern that most parents would prefer to send their daughters to the missionary high school where there's much less chance of this happening, but of course that's more expensive. If a girl runs off or is reported to have run off, usually there will be a great collection of people who will get together to go and try and find her. They will go to the nearby cities, they will look for her. It's amazing to me actually that people find individuals who have run off, and they do frequently. To me it seems like sort of looking for a needle in a haystack. But I guess they don't run that far. They run to the nearby cities where people still have lots of kith and kin. So girls are typically found and brought home. There was one story of a girl who, before the age of 15, had run off with her boyfriend 3 different times and had been brought back 3 different times, to the point where finally the mother and daughter moved to a different town for the daughter to go to high school. The boyfriend subsequently married another girl and has children. The girl who had run off with him 3 times is actually now has graduated from high school and is very accomplished. So that's interesting. We can debate at the end which way is is the reproductive success going. She's delaying reproduction, but she will be investing much more strongly in her offspring. But the other strategy is if they stay away until a child is born or until the girl is pregnant, frequently the parents will accept that marriage. So this is another story that I have heard several times, again in real time, stories of girls who have actually, at the time I was there, run away and been able to hide out until they're pregnant, and then they come home. And then frequently the marriage will be accepted by the parents. The costs of disrupting that marriage are now too high. And there was also a case of, there were several cases of this occurring where people have gotten married, run off, and stayed away until a child is born or until the woman is pregnant. So the Shuar example, I think, is likely to be consistent with other small-scale societies. This is a strongly paternalistic society. Again, there's some debate as to how much freedom women have in their everyday lives, but certainly ideologically it's strongly paternalistic, and ultimately men have the final authority if it comes to any question of who gets the right to make a decision. Women's choices are explicitly constrained in many domains, including sexual choices. So again, normatively, fathers have the ultimate decision on who a girl gets to marry. And they do, in fact, exert quite a deal of influence. As I said, it's fathers who will go and find their daughters and bring them back if they've eloped. Fathers will still today give their daughters away against their will in marriage. There are always conflicts of interest between parents and daughters regarding mate choices. So it is not the case that parents and daughters' influences will, or choices will 100% align, or that their interests will 100% align. Of course, they will align to a fair degree. Parental inclusive fitness is affected by daughters' mate choices. If we assume that daughters are choosing based on their reproductive fitness, this should have generally positive reproductive fitness for their parents. However, the parents have conflicts in that they are trying to mate off all of their offspring, bring in resources to the direct family unit, and have different sorts of preferences that they're looking for in a son-in-law or in an ally, particularly historically when this was somebody who was an ally in warfare as well as in resources. So there are conflicts of interest regarding mate choice between parents and daughters. There's also strong conflicts of interest between men and women regarding female sexual behavior. So again, women's sexual behavior can be constrained by their husbands, by their brothers, even often by their grown sons are looking out for them. So there are tangible costs. And again, this is something that I think is likely to be consistent across most small-scale societies. There are very tangible costs to opposing the wishes of parents or to defying one's husband or one's male kin. And importantly, we still see, despite those costs, we see that women can and do subvert the wishes of others in order to pursue their own preferences. And this is not just true in the Shuar. We see this basically in almost all ethnographic literature that discusses women's behaviors. We'll see instances, even if they're rare, of women who have defied their parents, defied their husbands, run away. Sometimes they're caught and have horrible consequences, but frequently they don't, and they pursue their own reproductive choices. And we see that even, for example, among the Yanomamo, who are also known to be a particularly violent culture, and we see also example of women running away from their husbands. So just to re-examine the standard cross-cultural sample data that Apostolo presented, I said I would show you what the actual categorizations are when you actually go back to the standard cross-cultural sample. If you recall, he had, I'm going to pull up that slide again. He gave us only 4 categories. Either parental arrangement and courtship with parental approval, or just plain courtship with free choice. If you look at the actual categories as they are listed in the standard cross-cultural sample, you actually have one category which is autonomous choice with no other approval necessary, or autonomous choice where kin or community approval is necessary or highly desirable, Or cases where individuals may choose their spouses, or they may approve the choice that somebody else has made for them, but where they're officially arranged. So these are officially arranged marriages, but essentially individuals are choosing their partners and then going through a third party to arrange them. There are societies where marriages may be either arranged or be arranged by individual choice. There are societies where parents have the choice, but individuals may object to their parents' choices. They may veto their parents' choices. And finally, there's only one category, which is really parental choice, in which individuals really can't object or really rarely do object, in fact. And so if we really break this down to those, and then there's this big chunk, 20%, where there's no data at all. Yeah, Arthur.
Are these categories that you've decided?
No, these are the categories. If you just
As
have
they're
a
actually
standard
coded.
cross-cultural sample, this is how the data are coded in terms of marital arrangement.
There are 7 choices.
There are 7 choices. Yeah, that's how it's coded in the standard cross-cultural sample. So if you look at this and you really think about the logical way to divide this up between whether there's some opportunity for choice or not, it looks like something like this, which is that for most societies, women have some opportunity to exert choice. And only 18%, based on these ethnographies and the way they're coded, suggest that there's really very little choice that women can exert in their marital decisions. Now, of course, that still doesn't cover adultery and premarital sex and all these other ways that females may exert their reproductive choices. So I would suggest that the kinds of mate preferences that have been documented in the evolutionary psychology literature that I outlined at the very beginning seem very well suited to the context I've just described, in which there may be very strong paternalistic control, may be very strong social constraints, and yet women do seek out their own preferences and pursue them. So some of the preferences that have been shown in the literature refer to developmental plasticity, so the idea that women pursue different strategies based on the context that they were raised in. So daughters or individuals who were raised in environments with cues to resource availability may seek out more stable partnerships. Those who were raised in environments with cues to resource instability or unpredictability may seek out more short-term mating. So this is a form of facultative response. Facultative preferences that are sensitive to potential risks in the environment. So again, the whole suite of ovulatory cycle studies is based on the premise that women are going to pursue genetic benefits via extra-pair strategies only when the benefits are possible to be, are available, when they're likely to conceive, and not during the rest of the cycle when they're unlikely to conceive. So we expect there to be facultative preferences and designed for opportunistic mating. The fact that women are sensitive to the current context and may alter their mating strategies given that context. So I would suggest that the question here is not that female choice has been overemphasized. I really don't think that that's, quite frankly, a problem in the literature. But I do think that the point that parental choice has been largely ignored is extremely well taken. And I think we need to think really hard about this. It is true that parental choice is a huge part of the mating context of human populations, cross-culturally, cross-historically. And if parental choice has played an important part in human evolution, we really should expect to find evidence of special design for a bunch of different things, for third-party mate preferences. So preferences for the mates of others. We should be able to document evidence of special design that parents have preferences for mates, not for themselves, but for somebody else. Or that kin have preferences that relate to the mating decisions of other people, not for themselves. And those should differ from one's own mating preferences. If I'm seeking a mate for myself, my preferences should be different than if I'm seeking a mate for my daughter. We should be able to document this. We should be able to find evidence of special design for third-party mate attraction. So the idea of signaling one's mate quality to individuals other than potential mates. So we have lots of research that's looked at the ways that people signal their mate quality to potential mates, but what about the ways in which they do signal that quality to kin of potential mates, or to parents of potential mates, or even potentially to other social allies of potential mates. And we should look for evidence of special design for mechanisms that are sensitive to the costs and benefits of either accepting parents' choices or defying parents' wishes. So this is not something that should be taken lightly, this idea of potentially going against parents' wishes or kin's wishes. Kin play an extremely important role in people's lives. They're an important source of cooperation and resources, and ultimately will usually help one with their own reproductive success, with raising their offspring. So what are the costs and benefits of potentially defying one's parents' or one's other kin's wishes versus going along with them? How big is the differential in terms of reproductive benefit to oneself, taking mom's choice or dad's choice, or taking one's own choice? And one idea that I've been thinking about along here, and I have no data on this yet, but one idea that I've been thinking about, and some of the people in this room have heard me talk about this before, is the idea of romantic passionate love, or limerence, as a mechanism that may actually be designed for parent-offspring conflict over mates. This is a kind of passionate love that is irresistible, causes one to cut ties with friends and family, to focus solely on the beloved, and that perhaps that may actually gain some traction on that emotion by thinking of it as an adaptation to parent-offspring conflict in regards to mate choice. So that's, I finished very early, that's really all I have, but I'm hoping that people have some thoughts on where to go with this.